welcome to the PCB Insight Conference 2021. And today we are looking at a very interesting topic, which is artificial intelligence. We try to consider if in the next 10 years, if AI is going to move us towards global welfare or global warfare. And we have a very interesting and eclectic panel to discuss this topic. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. And first is Adash, who is joining us from the UK. Adash is a data analytics consultant and manager. And over the years, he has been able to solve critical problems for business in areas of investments, capital markets. And right now, she's finding out how technologies is going to disrupt and enhance financial services. And he believes that we are in very interesting times and that there's group coming to all of finances, which we presented by mentioned to us. You Dash for joining us today. And also I have Andra. Yes. Okay. And also we have Andra. Andra is joining us from Switzerland. Andra is the head of product management at MDPI in Switzerland. She's a trained computer scientist and statistician, and also she has been involved in artificial intelligence, helping to curate information and peer reviewing articles for COVID research. And Andra is also an avid scuba diver. Thank you for joining us today. Andra, what's the deepest you've gone in your dives?
Oh, Egypt, Ras Mohammed National Park for sure.
Oh,
this will
okay.
go back.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us today. And we have our author joining us from Ireland. Author is a seasoned information security expert. He's got about 20 years of experience in infosec and cybersecurity, and he's also an engineer by training, and yeah, he's an expert in all things ISO 27001
more
and 3000. Yeah. And so we appreciate the fact that you guys have very diverse backgrounds, from information security to financial services and product management. And I think you guys are a fantastic panel that can help us answer some critical questions relating to artificial intelligence. So thank you for joining us one more time.
Thank you.
And so let's get started. So the first question we have here, and this is going to Adash. It's in the next 10 years, how fast and how far do you see artificial intelligence evolving, and which industries or which regions do you think are optimally placed to exploit the benefits of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, thank you, Solomon. I think it's a very interesting and a very difficult one to predict.
Okay.
But in my view, when we look back how things have evolved, obviously, the rise of computing, in my experience, has sort of turbocharged the speed in which we are able to adopt AI, right? Mm-hmm. Purely the data, the velocity, as well as the volume of data have increased so much, I think, right? And because of the digital transformation era, right? So I think looking back at that and looking at the future, I think the AI, a lot of the clients that I work with from a consulting perspective, people have been experimenting with AI cross industries. One of the key challenge that I see, where in terms of scaling up from where we are at the moment, is really how do you take it at an enterprise level and generate value out of it. So that is one angle. So there is a lot of thought and implications around privacy, data security, the ethical angle of AI. So those things, I think, in my view, would play quite an important role in terms of how AI is going to sort of evolve over next 10 years, if not 5 years. So those things would actually play, a very important role. And I think in terms of industries as such, the way I see is that anything where there is a potential for automation, AI would come into play on that. Adoption wise, it would depend on a couple, some of the parameters that I attributed to. But yeah, I think potential wise, it has got quite a lot of potential. There is obviously the hype versus the reality, which we need to be aware of. And the sort of the other element is you have insights which AI will generate, but how do you take it and make a sense of it in your business context? So I think these are some of the roles at a very high level, and again, I think there is that open question about from an impact perspective, right? Obviously, it's going to automate, so therefore you would see, the impacting the number of jobs, and there will be creation of jobs as well. But how it is going to impact some region, poorer countries versus richer countries, is something that needs to be looked at as well.
Okay. And can I ask you a question, Adarsh? Do you see any fundamental differences between applying AI in a commercial setting or by government or in a government setting? Do you see any fundamental issues between the two or differences between the two?
I think in terms of the adaptation piece in a government setting would certainly, the context in which you are looking at the welfare, the ethical angle of and the privacy angle of that would play quite a big role in a wider context, as opposed to, if you look at it in a commercial setting, a lot of the industry associated implications, be it around, your the regulatory angle or, specific in the industry context, what sort of consumer behavior and consumer privacies that you want to look at, those things will play a very specific role. But when it comes to a government setting, I strongly feel that there needs to be a wider play which comes in from the wider adoption of AI across industry view, as well as the national and international collaboration and human aspect will come into play as well.
Yeah, because
Okay.
Yeah.
If I may, on the evolution of
Andra?
AI, I think we have two aspects of it. One will be the theoretical side of things, where AI might evolve in a theoretical setting, research-wise, quite a lot. But the adoption, exactly what Adarsh was saying before, that will be the key point, and how it is going to be adopted in businesses or with government, with everything else, because theory is theory, but practice proves this very hard to implement and to scale it up to make it production grade if you want.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. There's the theoretical evolution of AI and the practical adaptation of what AI can do. Yeah, interesting times. Okay, so do you think these changes are going to be like, is it going to be like an evolution? Because we see some changes happening right now in the world of AI. Do we expect our lives to be massively disrupted in next 10 years, or is it going to be like a gradual change going on into 10, 20 years time? What speed do you think it's going to evolve at?
I think it depends on in which area you're at. So for areas where there's a lot of data in play, I'm thinking here, I don't know, biotech, agriculture, or even science, because I come from an academic setting and we do work with a lot of data. I think the speed will increase quite a lot and the adoption will be quite high. Whereas in other domains where there might be less data, less people involved, things will be slower. So I think it's a mixture of the two.
Oh,
yeah. In my opinion, sure. I see, especially for adaptation in government setting, where it's now already deployed, often in fraud detection with welfare and other stuff, that I think that is more like a stairway, if you know what I mean. It's taking big steps and then slowly evolving and then taking another big step again. And there's no, in some cases, there's no gradual application, I think, of AI technology. But it's you disrupt something, and then you have to, in my opinion anyway, make sure that all the processes that are there and appeal opportunities and anything else that needs to be in place needs to evolve with the technology more slowly, and then the next technology step can be implemented, and then you are following again a sort of evolutionary development. That's how I have seen things develop and deployed as well. So especially if you're working with a lot of people and your automated decision making can impact a lot of people, and you have to be really careful that you have everything in line, not only the technology, but you also make sure that everything else, and that you take due care and etc. And especially if you're making decisions that could impact people's lives really in a fundamental way. Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Arthur as well. So there is an industry context which would, bring some variations in terms of how you adapt AI. Certainly from a financial services standpoint, people have been cautious, with regards to deciding whether to give, approve a loan application or not, right? For example.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a tricky one. But I think, a lot of the challenges around in a business context, how do I take it from, it being an experimental phase to actually using it in my business model,
Yeah.
right? To drive business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there
Fantastic.
have been studies on this subject where say like 80% of AI projects that are prototypes never actually make it into production for exactly the reasons that were mentioned before, impact on processes that need to be changed and so on and so forth.
Okay. Now, speaking from a societal perspective, I mean, for the regular person on the street, a non-techie person, that's the general population, is AI going to cause more inequality or loss of jobs, or is it going to is it going to reduce the level of welfare that people get now from government or from industry? Is it creating more jobs?
I think it will change the jobs. So it's not about
Change jobs.
reducing, killing jobs or removing jobs. It's changing and evolving jobs. It's like, I don't know, electricity when it comes into play, or industrialization. People were doing certain types of jobs before that, and they evolved into doing other kinds of jobs afterwards. Yes, there will be this transition period in between where especially older generations might have troubles adapting to change, but in slow steps, things will evolve and jobs will evolve. So I believe that all in all, the jobs will be the same, only different. So the same in terms of number, volume, but different in terms of what exactly you're going to do on your day-to-day at work.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And electricity is a nice example, I think, because if you look at the people involved in electricity, there are so many different people involved, a lot of people involved in administration and other stuff. And I guess that those jobs are an option for further automation and AI. But people really coming down to your place and replacing your fuse box or whatever, I think those practical skills will remain and maybe even become more important and stronger as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the other side to look at that is, the creation of jobs can take different dimensions, right? So obviously you have technology-oriented jobs, right? Be it your data scientists or, data engineers who needs to sort of make it ready for AI model to consume data. So there is that angle. But the other question which I often sort of wonder about is, when you have the output of a model, you need people who can understand and take decisions, right? So those things are, so there is a reskill angle as well. In terms of, people reskilling and taking up these new jobs, which is an exciting place to be. But I think there is no shying away that there would be, sort of the mundane and, the jobs which can be automated, low-hanging jobs would definitely get automated through AI. It looks quite promising from that standpoint, I think.
Well, that means there's going to be a lot of reskilling, and the present way we teach in the schools, the things we teach in schools are going to have to change.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about, there'll be these soft skills kind of aspects that will not be replaced, at least from my point of view, not in our lifetimes or in the next 1-2 generations. That working with humans, coming to your place and replacing that light bulb if you need, you don't know how to.
Yeah, exactly.
They are trying. I've seen robots delivering pizzas and stuff in Moscow, I think it was.
Yeah.
But we are far away from going to complete replacement of the humans in all aspects of our day-to-day lives.
Exactly.
And I agree with Solomon as well that you need to rethink your education within your country or maybe even globally, saying if we are going to move towards that AI world, do we need to reevaluate what skills we need over in 10 or 20 years and what kind of people we need? So that's something that's really hard to do right now. I can imagine maybe you can use AI to help you make a decision on that as well. But I think it's a really challenging thing to see where do you want to take your skills and what kind of education do you need to be able to survive in the society 20 years from now.
Exactly.
Yeah, and interesting, so when I sort of work with clients, so lot of the work involved or thinking involved in AI implementation is really nothing to do with AI, but how would you, how do you see your organization, right?
Yeah.
What's your target operating model look like? What type of people will you have, right? To Arthur's point, and those discussions dominate, the entire implications of the journey really. Obviously, technology plays a key role.
Yeah.
But obviously, the technology is progressing quite fast with the advancement of cloud services. You no longer need to have all the setup done. The barrier to entry has sort of been reducing, right, over years.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's an interesting place.
Okay, I have an interesting question here. I mean, this is more towards the political aspect, because we hear a lot of talk about one country dominating in AI, and every other person is trying to play catch up. I mean, if you look at the way the world is, and you were asked to make a prediction, do you think it's going to lead to competition between countries? Is you see more cooperation, or just one country trying to dominate the other, and then there's potential for maybe warfare? What do you think is going to happen? This question goes to first to Arthur.
Interesting question, by the way. Yeah, I think that's really politics is always a really sensitive subject to talk about. But if I look at what the situation is right now in the world, I see more competition than cooperation, really, in my opinion. And I think AI and cyber, and whatever you want to call it, by the way, is going to be one of the next battlefields as well. And then AI will definitely, the better your AI is, the more battlefield advantage you have, I think. So I'm guessing that I see more like competition than cooperation. Maybe between allies there will be some sort of cooperation, but it's always never show all your playing cards or never put all your cards on the table, in my opinion anyway, because you see a shift from what's happening in warfare, and there will be a lot of electronic warfare or cyber or whatever you want to call it. Cyber, I don't really like the word, but it's a good umbrella to hang a lot of stuff under. But I think if you have AI advantage in that field, you will not just share it with anybody or everybody, and to give away your tactical or maybe even your strategic advantage. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a super interesting point, right? So there is that piece of the puzzle where you sort of scale up and democratize the AI, right? where there is a lot of collaboration can come in. And I genuinely think that there needs to be more collaboration, cross-border collaboration, you know,
or even open source, maybe open sourcing.
Yeah, open source, you know, that's a good point, right? A lot of the companies like Google and Amazon, you know, there is already a lot of open source stuff, right? So there is, you know, that collaboration and thing is coming in. So that's sort of the positive side of the coin, right? But as in life, you know, there got to be the other side as well.
Yeah.
You know, which is where I think it's again, like Oth said, it's fairly difficult to predict how things are because we never predicted where we will be, right?
No.
Before the computing era. Um, but I think there will be a part of the AI where you want to have the competitive advantage, like it is in any commercial world. I think that either be it country or companies, I think you would want to keep that on. The other aspect to look at is when AI becomes not just, you know, a play tool for data scientists and common people who doesn't understand technology can start to use it. That also helps competition as well in a way, right? So it's a very, you know, interesting balance in my opinion. You know, only time will say.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Andra,
think
please
both
weigh in here.
Adrash and Arthur make very good points. I would say that it's not about countries. I say it's more about the private sector because this globalization actually blurs the lines between countries. If you're talking Google or Facebook or Amazon, you're actually not talking about the country. You're talking about a company that has a global presence that has an impact on everybody's lives, regardless whether they're in the US or in Switzerland or in China or Australia. That's global. So there's a fine balance between what is country, what is corporate, how do we keep everybody in line, because in the end it's not about the government here. It's about making sure that the world is a better place. I'm an eternal optimist at heart, so I like to think things are good and things will be good.
Okay, well, let's hope that in the next 10, 20 years, we are all holding hands.
Virtually or physically,
Physically, yeah.
So,
by the way, Andre had an interesting point. Do you see the lines blurring between countries and tech companies? Will it become a sort of really a cloud thing that there are no more strict lines with respect to AI, obviously? What's your?
I would say the lines will become more and more fuzzy as we move forward, because I'm talking about, let's say, cloud. I want to put something in the cloud. My cloud is actually hosted part in Germany, part in Ireland, and part somewhere on the other side of the ocean. And I'm not entirely sure where my data is concretely or all the time, where they are contracts and everything. But to abstract as a little bit would be, it's there somewhere in the world. So, and I think this happens for everybody, and it will become fuzzy as we move forward. From my point of view,
more abstraction.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. In fact, in a way, if you see, things have already sort of becoming fuzzy, right? You know, we have got a lot of flexibility in terms of where we want our data to reside. You know, but you know, so obviously the transparency and privacy angle comes into play in this context. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Andrew. I think it's the collaboration is the way to go. We'll have to see how the competitiveness and, you know, relative value creation versus collaboration, how it's going to span out, right?
Yeah, agree.
So I've got another interesting question here. Let's talk about the data that AI is trained with. Well, there's been talk about some AI being biased and all that. So do you think the data we are using to train the AI is going to affect I mean, like the social injustice and the prejudice we have in society? Is it already baked into AI? Are we training AI with the right data? Let's start with Adash.
All right. Okay. Oh, it's a super interesting question, and I think you're right, Solomon. I think there are definitely, you know, multiple instances where you know, the model has learned the bias from the data. So the way I typically would look at, right, is sort of divide this into two categories, right? One is look at the data, right? Look at, is there a bias in the data, right? Bias could come in multiple different forms, right? And the second aspect is, obviously, if you have bias in the data, there are, how do you go about it, right? You need to have, sort of a business context to see whether that data is important to you. How is it going to, why do you need the data, for example, and how important that is for you to be able to, sort of predict some business outcome. The second aspect is when you actually look at the modeling, right? When you are actually building your algorithms, how the algo is actually behaving, right? Is it taking decisions based on some of the data items, like, for example, race, color, ethnicity, right? And so it is that element. And secondly, the other element, which sort of, is it slightly more difficult and open-ended problem, is even if you sort of define in your process that these are my, characteristics which I want to be careful of, the AI can actually just look at anything else from the data and can decide its own categories as well, right? So there are those elements to it, but the bias is, the way I see, I think there is increasing, awareness and sort of agreement that that needs to be looked at. Process they would follow, again, depending on the industry you speak to, it could take a slightly different form. But in terms of process, you still, the way I look at it is I look at it in these two buckets at a high level.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree. I think in my personal experience, the quality of your decision making or your machine learning model depends strongly on the data you have used to train the model, and also it's often the edge cases that are supported by human decision making as well that might maybe unconsciously even introduce some bias as well into the model. And the second question that more or less comes out of that is there any way to, well, temper or remove the bias from an established system as well? I think that's really a difficult process as well.
I think you're making a very valid point. There's like, you need to know that there's a bias to actually try to do something about the bias, because there's this unconscious bias thing that we as humans have, so we don't need AI to go there, because in the end, as Adarsh was saying, AI is a model that takes what we know, the data, to predict certain outcomes. So we do this even if I'm planning a dinner, I'm using a model that is in my head. I can make it with data and put it in a computer, and it will predict what I'm eating for dinner. But there's so many little tweaks here and there. My dinner will be influenced, but I don't like broccoli. Okay, so I will never have broccoli at my dinner ever. And that's a bias. So we need to look at the models and the data and to understand how it affects what the outcome is.
Interesting. Personally, I think, go ahead, Adarsh.
No, I was just sort of closing the loop that, one of the things is transparency, right? We have been speaking about transparency in the process, and which is where challenges of how do you operationalize the AI into business process. You've got to have all these things being, thought through, and at least that on what basis things are being. It gets challenging, to Arthur's point. How do you retrofit or reflect on what has already been done? It's a bit of a challenge. But at least you focus on what's being developed, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with in what field are you applying your AI as well. If you're doing it in a fraud detection context, then your data set is probably already biased anyway. So I think there will be a lot of ethical implications if AI is going to make serious decisions about people's lives. How ethical are the decisions, and can you control them or can you steer them? Because Adarsh mentioned it already, AI is just looking at all the data that you provided with, and it may decide to look at different things that you haven't thought of, or see patterns that are really hard for a person to detect in the data that you're feeding.
I think I should ask a follow-on question, which dovetails into this one, which is about the ethics of AI. And there's this recent story about an executive in Google who resigned. That is their ethics chief. of AI because she didn't believe in how the AI was being used. And personally, I'm wondering if we know that the issues we have in human society, they get transferred into the models we use to train our AIs. So what should be the right approach in terms of handling ethics with artificial intelligence? This is both, and it's like, I'd say it's almost like a philosophical question right now, because that's where we are at right now. What do you think?
I can start with this one if I don't know if it was directed to somebody, or I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ethics is a very delicate topic, and there's different bits and pieces. And the lady that you're talking about, Timnit something, she was challenging. There are others that have started raising concerns about how AI is trained, and from very simple examples like facial recognition, that there were models that were not recognizing darker complexions just because the data used to train was not involving darker complexion skin people. Or police work, how it does, they assign police to areas where there's more crime, and obviously if there's more police, they will find more crime, things that normally would never get reported just because they're so petty and so tiny that nobody is going to say something about it. So there's a vicious circle. And in terms of ethics, it's a thin line. We need to start somewhere. In some cases, it's easier to do something about it. In other cases, we as a society are already biased and we have ethical issues without the help of AI. So there's a bigger debate that needs to happen. And here is where governments and countries should come into play, because they are the ones that actually can enforce regulations and can do something about it. You are not allowed to do, I don't know, use my data for credit scoring or proposing advertising online or other types of use cases that use AI at scale.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need some sort of, just for the financial industry, you have regulations and requirements. I think you will need some sort of independent, I think, body that you can ask about ethics and that can evaluate the ethics. And there might even be, for PCB, that could be an interesting thing, is a sort of ethics audit every year on your AI decision making or stuff, because especially if it's done on a wide scale by tech companies or by governments, it can impact so many people's lives. And especially, and it's something I call the computer says no syndrome, more or less, that if the AI has made a decision, people can always say, yeah, it was the computer, it wasn't me. And the appeal opportunities are maybe reduced, or you cannot appeal to an automated decision anymore. So you need that strong ethics regulation, in my opinion, especially if it's done on a really big, if you apply AI on machine learning on a really big scale, or nationwide, or maybe even globally.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree. There needs to be some sort of central governing mode, whatever term we use, right? Where there can be conscious among what are the different biases and what are the different drawbacks and how can we align on that. The other thing that I also feel is that in this context, you have data privacy and those laws which are there. It's the question of taking that and how you extrapolate that, just go beyond the data and come into AI context of how that data is being used, as opposed to just focusing from a data privacy content, perspective, where you are just looking at where the data is and who can access the data. Now you're also looking at, out of those data, how it can be used to make some decisions as well, right? So that is that aspect as well, which is a bit of area of focus, I think.
Yeah, the one thing that we need to take into account then is that technology evolves at a much faster pace than that your regulators and regulation and lawmakers can follow. So there needs to be a sort of balance between those. interesting example I just heard from a friend of mine. He said, well, there is now a lot of AI used in banks that's used to detect fraud, but the regulators want to know exactly what made the decision that a transaction is fraudulent or suspicious.
Yeah.
But the bank can only say, well, we have an AI model here. We don't know how it works, but it detects these and these kind of transactions. So
Yeah.
the auditability and traceability is more or less lost. So that could be a really interesting juxtaposition of interests from different parties. And I am really curious about the first case in court when the bank cannot show how they came to that decision. What will happen to any results from those kind of automated decisions?
Actually,
Yeah.
you know, I must give an example here, Arthur, you know,
Yeah,
very
sure.
related to your point. Obviously, I'm not going to name the client.
No, obviously.
But, you know, we were sort of doing, you know, we were working out to sort of do a model for them. We created a, you know, a model which worked perfectly fine, very high accuracy rate, low false positives, and all the good stuff. But because, you know, it became so complex, it was difficult to sort of, you know, pinpoint on what basis. How do you explain, you know, the importance of the inputs which goes into that? And we went into discussions, and then we ended up coming with a slightly inferior model in terms of, you know, complexity. But the trade-off was that we were able to explain it, right? So it's a very real situation.
Exactly.
And I'm sure we will have, you know, more such examples as we get into, you know, this difficult and, you know, sort of the awkward questions around why something, you know, why, on what basis the algo is taking a decision that it is taking,
Yeah.
really.
Exactly. Yeah.
We actually have a similar situation with explain. We are making review recommendation for our papers, and we need to make sure that we explain why we're recommending certain people. So we also ended up in a similar type of situation with, do we want a model that is able to explain why the decision is there, or do we want something that pretty much gives you a list of people and doesn't tell you why that person is there? So we chose the model that explains why that person is there in order to support. So for us, it's more on the human in the loop type of situation.
Yeah.
We have AI as a decision support system, and we tried, because we publish academic papers, and we cannot allow decision to be made by computers. We need humans to make those kinds of decisions because they have massive impact on society.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
I think even the GDPR has a clause, I think, that says that you cannot make completely automated decisions that could impact people's lives. So there would, if you do it properly, according to GDPR, there would always be a person somewhere in the loop or at the end making the final decision. I think that's the only catch-all that you can build into the system currently, in my opinion.
Well, but if you look at it also on the flip side, it looks as if, excuse me, humans are actually holding back AI to some extent. We're like limiting how fast it is evolving because we say we always want to insert ourselves into the process. Is that so?
Yeah, I think that's a good point you raise, because I come from an InfoSec background, so I always say, well, you need to make sure that it's 100% secure. Well, I'm not saying that, but people in InfoSec say, but they forget other aspects like business and people, etc. And I think you need to find a balance. You always have to determine what does it bring me and what does it cost me, and you have to find the balance there. And just being driven by technology alone, I think that will crush individuals if you're not careful, especially with AI and major decision making in AI.
Yeah,
I actually view it a little bit. Go on, others. Yeah.
No, Andrea, you go ahead.
I actually view it a little bit different. So it's exactly AI is helping humans work faster and do things better rather than humans are holding AI back, because in the end, AI, as any other type of thing that we are building, is to help us as a society evolve and to do things better. If I'm taking examples from publishing and I want to look at manipulated images, if I were to put humans to do that, it will take a very long number of hours and a lot of people to evaluate every single image. But if we put an AI model, we can flag the ones that are potentially fraudulent and then have somebody check and validate whether those images are fraudulent or not. So it's more on the helping the humans rather than holding back the AI.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, good point.
Well, for me, it's
I was literally coming to the same point. One of the ways is also to help the humans to Andrea's point. You can build thresholds and alerts around the output of a model and operationalize it as a part of your business process, so that like if they were having to sort of look at 1,000 cases and go through them, they would instead get maybe 10 or 20 of them, right, based on threshold. You can always sort of squeeze or expand it based on, just to sort of help things out. So that's another aspect to look at. There are obviously advantages of the automation efficiency angle.
Yeah, agree. Yeah,
makes sense. If we can't, if something goes wrong, we cannot sue the AI, but we can sue the human. So the human must be in the loop. That's my opinion.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why do you allow the algorithm that cannot be sued to make the decision? So always human for me. We've got some questions from the audience, and there's a question that says, will there be a standardization of AI training data? And who do we saddle with this responsibility? Author, would you like to
that's a good question. I'm not sure if you can standardize data, because AI is always applied in a very specific situation and context. And even if you have the same AI, but you have two different companies, that model and that decision making will be different. I do think, and maybe we can use AI for that as well, is to do a sort of assessment of your training data and see if you can determine some sort of bias in it as an early warning. Maybe that's one of the applications that I see. I'm not sure if you can define a standardized set of data to train your AI. Maybe you can verify the set, but I think it's always really tied into the context where you are applying AI. Not sure if any.
Yeah, no, I think. Yeah, no, that's a fair point, I think, because the data sort of decides the model. It's not the other way around, right? And industry context could mean sort of the difference between two models. One thing that can be though done is maybe improved a little bit. If you got a data like Arthur was saying, you can have some sort of a unsupervised model to sort of figure out, right, how the data is there like bias in the data. You can do some pre stuff. You can bring some efficiencies in the process in terms of automating it. But I think if you're purely looking at solving a particular business problem with AI, then that problem is in relation to the data, right? And therefore the model is tied to that. So we do have transfer learning where you can apply it, but then again, you have to be very careful to look at the context and the problem that you are solving, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and Andra, you have a statistics background, right?
Yes.
Can statistics help us in any way, just to filter out the 80% most likely or something like that? Is that?
I wouldn't go there because the variations in the data model, the data itself is quite broad, so it depends. And if I were to take a very, very simple example, language quality, so the quality of an English language. If I'm writing a book about, I don't know, cookbook, I might have one way of speaking. If I'm writing an academic paper, it will be written completely different. And that's something that we all speak, and the data should be the same because it's English language grammar, but the way to train and the data you use will be completely different, because what a normal human would say, I'm cooking something, would be completely different from what a scientist would put in that research paper.
Yeah.
So even for simple cases, variations are too broad to standardize or to use statistics. Maybe in a field, Like you're talking about science or research, where there's maybe you can apply something, but not at scale, not cross industry, at least from my point of view.
Okay.
So speaking of standards, do you think the standards are keeping up with the pace of innovation in AI? So I think someone said something about the regulators are always far behind the changes. So in terms of AI, so if you try to standardize the AI, for example, how do you think the standards folks can even keep up with the pace of innovation? Andrea, what do you think?
To certain aspects, maybe, but I don't think we are not. I think it's like regulators, laws. Laws will evolve after things happen. Otherwise, and at least I see it like that. What do you, Arthur, Adrash, what do you guys think?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. But I think you're right. I think technology comes first, then your certifications or your standardization follows, and then trailing behind that will be your regulators and your lawmakers, I think. And I guess standardization will become a good instrument to validate your AI, I guess, but we needed to do a lot of work to be able to have a sort of standard or ethical standard or whatever you want to call it before we can rely on it. But I do see a lot of work to be done there, and I think it's good to have a sort of maybe a standardization or certification of an AI model or the data or the combination of those to make sure that it's reliable enough and that everything that falls out of the 80% bandwidth that is handled by proper other humans or other decision makers.
Yeah,
Okay.
certainly. I think at a principle level, right? Principally, I think you can have some principles, in terms of what type of data, how it's done, how do you explain what's playing a role in what the model is deciding. Is some factor more important than others, right? So you can have in principle define that. The challenge that I have seen is that it is so different in the with regards to the problem you're trying to solve. It could be quite different. So the challenge is it's sort of converging and having that, and then when you come to a industry or a specific client situation, it can take a different color, for example, right? So that's the challenge. But I agree, with Arthur that in principle, I think we need to do some work to sort of at least lay some foundational blocks around that, right? And then you ask the right questions in the context of the problem.
Exactly, and I think you should, if you take a look at ISO 27001, which is one of the things I know a little bit about, is that is focusing on information security, and it's doing the same thing. It tries to establish a sort of baseline that validates how did you come to your implementation, or how did you derive all your security controls, and maybe you should follow a similar model for AI. How did you train your model? How did you make sure that you eliminated bias as much as you could? How do you handle edge cases and stuff like that? So maybe that's more the processes surrounding the application of AI in your specific organization that could be certified, and at least give a sort of baseline on objectivity and maintenance and traceability and all the other aspects that are really important here.
Yeah, and if I may bring in, I think traceability and auditability is an important factor, and which is where I think we also need to look at, what sort of infrastructure, what sort of platforms, right, where you are going to use the model, train the model. So we at Credera, we focus quite a lot around that, obviously from a consulting perspective. But I think that's an important point as well, because you have a lot of out-of-the-box platforms. You can build stuff on, Microsoft or Amazon cloud. where you can actually track what experiments have you done, and what's the sort of why you have chosen a model out of the 100 experiments you have done, for example. So I think there needs to be a lot of rigor around that to sort of tighten the process as well, so that you can always go back and sort of trace back to why some model has been chosen and why the output has been what it has been, for example, right? So there is that infrastructure element as well, is what my point is.
Okay, we are approaching, we have about 10 minutes more, and we're trying to get as much questions as possible from the audience. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and then we can go round robin and have like 30 seconds for response each. So there's a question here that says, how do you get a, let me read it out. It says, are there any concepts for audits, regulation of AI algorithm or decision making, including correction or elimination of unwanted decision criteria that may be conducted by non-AI experts? Now, the key thing is the person is a non-AI expert. For example, a C-suite, for example, how can they make a decision on AI? What should they look out for when they have to make a decision? They are not scientists, they are just in the C-suite. So let's
Maybe
start
I
with
can take this
Andra.
one. I wanted to take this one because I speak from a business perspective. I do not implement AI models. I'm the product, I'm the business, so I'm the person deciding whether a model gets built into the product or not. Okay. So there are certain metrics that we have to validate every time we have a model or the data science teams comes up with a model. They are presented with certain metrics, accuracy, false positive, false negatives, recall precision, etc. So it depends on what we are trying to achieve. And they always present exactly the same metrics for the models they are preparing in order for us to make decisions. And also present cases that I can understand. So the reason I was always using like examples, my dinner, English language, because these are things that our data scientists are forced to talk into so that we can present this to the rest of the business. Data science is quite a small team. The business is 5,000 plus people, so they will have to understand what they are doing. So it's on the presentation model.
Okay. Yeah. Arthur, what do you think?
I completely agree with Andra. It's the same with all other stuff. You need to be able to present it to the business, and I think the technology is moving too fast. So you should make sure that the processes around that application of that technology are at least understood and aligned with your business, and give you enough guarantees that you are doing it as you want it to be done, ethically, and all kinds of other issues involved.
Okay. Adarsh?
Yeah, no, I think completely agree with both of them. I think it's the operationalization and having the right toll gates in place, which helps sort of a non-technology based business community to be able to understand. The only other point is like Andrea was saying, it's also being able to present it in a non-technology term, what it means, in the business terms of model taking a decision based on some attribute, so that it helps to sort of facilitate the business decision making.
Interesting. Thank you very much. So there's one more other question that says, as we head towards autonomous AI, who do we hold accountable for the action of this autonomous AI? I don't know. Is anyone a lawyer here?
No.
The cloud. We blame the cloud always.
Yeah.
The cloud.
It's Skynet always. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a good question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now I'm thinking you mentioned autonomous AI, and I'm thinking of those robots that I see sometimes, those movies, the dog robot, which they put sniper rifles on and stuff like that. So I think at the end of the day, you cannot hold the technology responsible. Technology is always applied by people and serving a purpose for people, in my opinion. And I think if you follow the chain long enough, you will always find someone who is the ultimate beneficiary of the things that you're doing. So you should hold him or her accountable for what happens. But and the same thing applies really to the AI that is used in self-driving cars, which are already on the streets out there. Is it the driver that you hold responsible, the manufacturer of the software, or the people who train the AI? So I think that will be really pressing questions in the short term as well. And yeah, at the end of the day, if somebody makes money off of it, then I think the person making the money should be held accountable in the end as well.
That is common sense, eh?
Yeah,
It's only fair that
just
way.
follow the money. Follow the money. That's the best thing sometimes.
Okay.
On the
Adarsh?
same topic,
Okay.
Adarsh,
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead,
no,
Andrea.
I think follow the money. Arthur said it all.
follow the money. That is
Follow the
a
money.
very valid point. The
Yeah,
AI that we have today is not AI that is learning by itself. It's trained by somebody at the end. So it's the model. We are not at that stage where AI learns from itself and it evolves in random ways without any kind of supervision. So we are quite far away from that today, as in 2021. Maybe in the next 10 years, things will be completely different. But as of today, we still can hold somebody accountable for who trained the model, where is it placed, and the follow the money thing is always something that we can do. So I like that point.
and I think to sort of extend that point a little bit, right? So when you are adopting AI, I think one of the things which goes back to what I was telling earlier is 80% of that is nothing to do with AI or models per se. So it's about defining, how your business process and business architecture will look like, right? Who is going to be responsible for what? So those things needs to be, carefully crafted with the right, the C-level. If you're talking in a commercial settings, you need to have the right alignment and right responsibilities defined. What obviously the model is going to tell you is that it is going to give you the error rate threshold and a lot of the parameters that will help you making a decision. But I think, like Andrea said, we are far from having AI to sort of, robots taking over the world, as they say. I think we are a bit far from that, I think.
Okay. I have the last question for Andrea. So if you were to advise the C-suites, and how would you tell them to prepare for AI to capture its benefits to ensure it's ethically deployed and to ensure that it leads to general welfare? How would you, if you were to speak in business terms to advise the C-suite, what would you say?
That's a very good question, and I will have to go talk to my CEO after this meeting because I will have to have exactly this type of conversation. Now, joke aside, there are areas where AI makes sense if we have the data. So implementing AI we are implementing AI where AI will benefit, that will not happen if we don't have the data, if we don't have the people, and if we don't have the process. So I would never go to my CEO and tell her, look, we need to do AI. No, we need to do this because we have the data, we have the people, and this is the benefit that it should bring us. This is the process that we want to optimize using AI. It's not let's do AI. AI is a fancy word, it's a buzzword, and it doesn't mean anything if you don't have the implementation and the. I'm saying data all the time because it all comes down to the data. If you don't have the data, you can build the best model possible. Without data, that model will not make any kind of sense and it will yield very, very bad results. So,
thank you very much. Arthur, final words, 30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds. Well, I completely agree with Andra, and it's AI is a tool, and we're more or less at the same position now as we were a lot of years ago when we introduced information technology. It's the same thing. It's how you apply it, just with anything else. And please don't combine AI with 3D printing, because that might turn up some nasty things. That's the only thing that I would like to say.
Okay, all right. And Adarsh, final words.
Yeah, I think one last but not the least, at least. So when we look at AI, right, I think Andreas spoke about the data. Data is the fundamental part of, how good or how bad your model is going to be. I think that's where, a lot of companies, they want to do AI, but then they don't have the right sort of framework or infrastructure to, sort of digest, process the data, right? So there is a heavy component of the success lies in, capability to sort of being able to digest the velocity and the volume of the data, and then sort of feeding it into the data model. So that's a key component which often gets not discussed when in the typical AI discussions, but that's a very important part according to me.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for your time. I honestly learned a lot. I did some research before coming here, but listening to you guys talk, you guys are an amazing panel. Thank you for your time,
Thank you.
and we'll connect and see how we can build a better world using artificial intelligence. Have a
Good idea.
wonderful day ahead.
Thank you
Everybody
so
have
much.
a good day. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everybody. Have a
Okay.
lovely
Bye.
evening.
Yeah,
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.